The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned warehouse district when Detective Sarah Martinez first heard the screams. She had been tracking the notorious gang known as the Red Serpents for 3 months, following a trail of robberies and violence that had terrorized the city's downtown area. What she didn't expect was to find herself face to face with someone who would change everything she thought she knew about justice and survival. Maya Chen had been 17 when her world collapsed. Her parents owned a small electronics shop in Chinatown, working 16-hour days to build a better life for their only daughter. They had dreams of sending her to college, of watching her become the doctor or lawyer they never could be. Those dreams died on a cold Tuesday evening when the Red Serpents came collecting their so-called protection money. The gang had been expanding their territory, pushing into neighborhoods that had previously been safe. They demanded monthly payments from every business owner, threatening violence against those who refused. Maya's father, a proud man who had fled poverty in his homeland, refused to bow down to thugs. He believed in the law, in the police, in the system that was supposed to protect honest people trying to make a living. His faith proved fatal. The Red Serpents made an example of the Chen family that would echo through the community for months to come. They didn't just destroy the shop or rough up her parents. They made it personal, brutal, and permanent. Maya watched from the store's back room as masked men systematically destroyed everything her family had built, beating her father unconscious while her mother pleaded for mercy that never came. The police response was typical of an overwhelmed system dealing with gang violence. They filed reports, took statements, and promised to investigate. Detective Martinez had been assigned to the case, but like dozens of others, it quickly became buried under paperwork and bureaucracy. The Chen family's tragedy became just another statistic in a city struggling with rising crime rates. Maya's parents survived the physical attack, but the psychological damage ran deeper. Her father couldn't work anymore, his hands shaking whenever he tried to handle tools or electronics. Her mother developed severe anxiety, jumping at every shadow and sound. The family lost their business, their income, and their sense of security. They were forced to move to a cramped apartment in a rougher part of town, where the Red Serpent's influence was even stronger. For months, Maya watched her parents fade away, becoming shells of the vibrant people they had once been. She applied for part-time jobs to help pay the rent, but every employer in the neighborhood knew about the Chen family's troubles. Some were sympathetic, but too afraid of gang retaliation to hire her. Others simply didn't want to get involved with someone who had crossed the Red Serpents. The breaking point came 6 months after the attack. Maya's father, unable to cope with his injuries and the family's financial ruin, suffered a massive heart attack. The doctors said it was brought on by stress and depression. As Maya sat in the hospital waiting room, watching her mother cry over her father's still form, something fundamental changed inside her. The girl who had once believed in playing by the rules, in trusting authority to protect the innocent, began to die. Her father's funeral was attended by only a handful of people. The community that had once embraced the Chen family now kept their distance, afraid that association might make them targets. Maya stood at the graveside, listening to the priest's words about forgiveness and moving on, but all she could hear was the echo of her father's screams from that terrible night. The police investigation had gone nowhere. Detective Martinez had tried to follow up, but without witnesses willing to testify and with the gang's influence spreading through the neighborhood, there was little evidence to pursue. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and cold leads while the Chen family's suffering continued. Maya's transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small acts of rebellion, spray painting gang symbols with corrections, leaving anonymous tips about drug deals, following suspected gang members to learn their routines. She studied them the way she had once studied for school exams, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. She discovered that the Red Serpents, despite their reputation for violence, were actually quite predictable. They operated in patterns, met at the same locations, and relied on intimidation more than actual firepower. Most of their weapons were for show, cheap handguns and knives meant to scare business owners and rival gangs. They weren't prepared for someone who had nothing left to lose. Maya's mother tried to pull her daughter back from the edge, sensing the dangerous direction her thoughts were taking. But grief and rage had taken root too deeply. The girl who had once dreamed of college and a normal life was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. She began to plan, to prepare, to imagine a different kind of justice than what the system had failed to provide. Maya's first weapon was her father's old hunting rifle, a relic from his younger days when he had tried to assimilate into American culture by taking up outdoor sports. The rifle had been gathering dust in their apartment's tiny closet, forgotten among boxes of family photographs and documents. When she pulled it out and held it for the first time, Maya felt a strange mixture of fear and power coursing through her hands. She had never fired a gun before, but the internet became her teacher. YouTube videos showed her how to clean and maintain the weapon, how to load ammunition, how to aim and control recoil. She practiced with empty chambers in her bedroom, learning to hold the rifle steady despite its weight. The mechanical actions became routine. Check the safety, load the clip, sight the target, breathe slowly, squeeze the trigger. Her first target wasn't random. Marcus Rivera had been the red serpent who had personally beaten her father, identifiable by a distinctive scar running down his left cheek and a habit of wearing expensive gold chains stolen from his victims. Maya had followed him for weeks, learning his schedule, his hangouts, his routines. He spent most evenings at a pool hall 6 blocks from her apartment, playing games and bragging about his latest crimes to anyone who would listen. The shot came from a fire escape across the street, during a rainy Tuesday night when the streets were mostly empty. Maya had positioned herself carefully, calculating angles and escape routes like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. The rifle's report echoed off the brick buildings, and Marcus Rivera crumpled to the sidewalk outside the pool hall, his gold chain scattered across the wet concrete. The police response was swift but ineffective. Detective Martinez arrived at the scene within minutes, finding a growing crowd of onlookers and a victim who would survive but never walk normally again. The bullet had shattered Rivera's right leg, a precise shot that suggested both skill and intention. This wasn't a gang shooting or a robbery gone wrong. Someone had deliberately targeted a red serpent with surgical precision. Maya watched the news coverage from her apartment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Rivera was alive but crippled, his days of intimidating shopkeepers and collecting protection money effectively over. Yet the victory felt hollow. One gang member down meant nothing when dozens of others continued to terrorize the neighborhood with impunity. The red serpent's retaliation was predictable and brutal. Unable to identify Maya as the shooter, they lashed out at the community in general, assuming someone was harboring information about the attack. They vandalized shops, roughed up elderly residents, and increased their demands for protection money. The message was clear: cross the red serpents and everyone suffers. This collective punishment only strengthened Maya's resolve. She realized that half measures wouldn't work against an organization that responded to violence with greater violence. The rifle, effective as it had been, was too limited. She needed something that would send a clearer message, something that would make the entire gang think twice about their actions. Research led her to crossbows, medieval weapons that had found new life among modern hunters and enthusiasts. Unlike firearms, crossbows were easier to obtain and modify. They were silent, accurate, and could be fitted with various types of ammunition. Most importantly, they could be customized with attachments that would turn a simple hunting tool into something far more intimidating. Maya spent her savings on a high-end compound crossbow, the kind used by serious hunters pursuing large game. The weapon was sleek and modern, constructed from lightweight carbon fiber and equipped with precision optics. In the right hands, it could drive a bolt through engine blocks or thick wooden doors. In Maya's hands, it would become an instrument of psychological warfare. The modifications came next. Maya had always been good with her hands, a trait inherited from her father's electronics work. She learned to machine custom bolt heads, to balance projectiles for maximum accuracy, and to calculate trajectories for different ranges and conditions. Each bolt became a work of engineering, designed not just to wound but to terrify. Her second target was Antonio Reeves, Rivera's replacement, and a man known for his cruelty toward elderly business owners. Maya had observed him shaking down Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who ran a small grocery store and could barely afford her medication, let alone protection money. The image of Reeves towering over the frightened old woman had burned itself into Maya's memory. The attack came during Reeves's morning routine, as he walked to his car after spending the night at his girlfriend's apartment. Maya had positioned herself on a rooftop across the street, the crossbow resting on a makeshift bipod she had constructed from spare parts. The bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a parked car. But this bolt was different from a simple hunting arrow. Maya had attached a small explosive device to the tip, a modified firecracker that detonated on impact. The explosion wasn't large enough to kill, but it sent a clear message. Smoke rose from Reeves's shoulder as he screamed in pain and terror, blood mixing with gunpowder residue on his expensive jacket. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Word spread through the gang network within hours. Someone was hunting red serpents with explosive ammunition. The shooter wasn't just trying to wound or disable their targets. They were making a statement about escalation and determination. Fear began to creep into conversations that had previously been filled with bravado and confidence. Detective Martinez found herself facing a new kind of case entirely. The evidence suggested a single shooter, someone with advanced planning skills and access to specialized equipment. The precision of the attacks, the careful target selection, and the escalating nature of the weapons all pointed to someone with a personal vendetta against the Red Serpents. This wasn't gang warfare or random violence, it was a campaign of systematic intimidation. The news spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. Someone was hunting the Red Serpents with weapons that seemed to come from a war zone rather than the streets. Gang members who had once strutted through the neighborhood with arrogant confidence now looked over their shoulders constantly, jumping at every sound and shadow. The explosive crossbow bolts had introduced an element of unpredictability that shattered their sense of security. Maya watched their fear with cold satisfaction. She had studied enough psychology to understand that terror was often more effective than actual violence. The Red Serpent's power had always been based on intimidation, making others afraid to resist them. Now they were experiencing that same fear, and it was eating away at their organization from within. Her third target required more planning and patience. Diego Santos was the Red Serpent's enforcer, a massive man with a reputation for extreme brutality. He had personally been responsible for putting 2 business owners in the hospital and was rumored to carry multiple weapons at all times. Santos never traveled alone and rarely followed predictable patterns, making him a much more challenging target than Rivera or Reeves had been. Maya spent 3 weeks studying Santos, learning his habits and identifying his few vulnerabilities. She discovered that he visited his elderly grandmother every Sunday afternoon, always parking his car in the same spot outside her apartment building. It was a brief window of opportunity, but Maya had become expert at making the most of such moments. The attack came as Santos was leaving his grandmother's building, his guard down after spending time with family. Maya had positioned herself in an abandoned building across the street, the crossbow loaded with her most sophisticated bolt yet. This one contained a small incendiary device designed to create a spectacular visual effect while causing maximum psychological impact. The bolt struck Santos in the upper thigh, and the subsequent explosion sent flames shooting across his leg and torso. The chemical mixture Maya had developed burned hot and bright, creating a pillar of fire that could be seen for blocks. Santos rolled on the ground, screaming in terror as much as pain, while his grandmother's neighbors called the fire department and police. The image of Diego Santos, the Red Serpent's most feared enforcer, writhing, on fire in front of his grandmother's apartment building, became legendary in the neighborhood. Cell phone videos of the incident circulated on social media, creating a mythology around Maya's attacks that grew with each retelling. She became known as the Ghost, a phantom who could strike anywhere with weapons that seemed almost supernatural. The Red Serpent's response was desperate and unfocused. They began wearing body armor and traveling in larger groups, but these measures only made them more conspicuous and less effective at their usual activities. Their protection racket suffered as business owners began to believe that someone was finally fighting back against gang intimidation. Some even refused to pay, betting that the Ghost would continue targeting Red Serpent members. Maya's mother had begun to suspect something was wrong. Her daughter had become distant and secretive, spending hours away from home without explanation. The girl who had once shared everything with her parents now moved through their apartment like a stranger, carrying herself with a new kind of hardness that frightened the older woman. But Maya's mother was too consumed by her own grief and trauma to fully understand what was happening. "Detective," Martinez was under increasing pressure to solve what the media had begun calling the Crossbow murders, even though none of the victims had actually died. The mayor's office was fielding calls from community leaders demanding action, while the police chief worried about copycat attacks and escalating gang violence. Martinez had developed a profile of the shooter: intelligent, methodical, probably young, definitely carrying a personal grudge against the Red Serpents. The detective had also noticed something interesting about the target selection. Each victim had been involved in attacks on civilian businesses, rather than rival gang members. The shooter seemed to be specifically targeting those who preyed on innocent people, rather than engaging in gang warfare. This suggested someone with a strong moral code, possibly someone who had been personally victimized by the Red Serpent's protection racket. Maya's fourth attack marked a significant escalation in both technique and psychological warfare. She had identified Carlos Mendez, a Red Serpent lieutenant who specialized in recruiting young teenagers into the gang through a combination of bribes and threats. Mendez operated from a community center parking lot, approaching kids as they walked home from school and offering them money and protection in exchange for loyalty. This time, Maya didn't just want to wound Mendez. She wanted to send a message to anyone who might consider following his path. She spent days preparing a special bolt, one that would create maximum visual impact while ensuring that news cameras would capture every detail. The explosive component was larger and more sophisticated, designed to create an impressive fireball that would dominate the evening news. The attack came during the afternoon shift change at a nearby factory, ensuring maximum witnesses as workers headed home past the community center. Maya had positioned herself on the roof of a school building, using the height advantage to compensate for the longer range. The bolt struck Mendez in the back as he was talking to a group of 13-year-old boys, and the resulting explosion knocked him forward into the chain-link fence surrounding the parking lot. The fireball rose 15 feet into the air, creating a mushroom cloud of smoke and flame that was visible from downtown. Mendez survived, but his expensive leather jacket was completely destroyed and his hair was singed off. More importantly, the teenage boys he had been trying to recruit ran screaming from the scene, and cell phone footage of the explosion was viewed millions of times within hours. The psychological effect on the Red Serpents was devastating. Their leadership began to fragment as members questioned whether their activities were worth the risk of being targeted by someone with increasingly sophisticated weapons. Some gang members left town entirely, while others simply stopped participating in the protection racket that had been the organization's primary source of income. Maya felt a growing sense of power and purpose. Each successful attack proved that the system's failures could be corrected through direct action. The police and courts had been unable or unwilling to protect her family and community, but her crossbow was achieving results that years of legal proceedings never could. She was no longer the helpless victim of gang violence. She had become something far more dangerous. The Red Serpent's desperation led them to make a critical mistake. Unable to identify their tormentor and facing mounting pressure from attacks that were devastating their operations, they decided to strike back at the entire community. If someone was hiding information about the ghost, they would make everyone suffer until that person was revealed. The gang's retaliation began with a coordinated assault on the very businesses they had once protected. In a single night, Red Serpent members firebombed 3 shops, vandalized 2 restaurants, and severely beat an elderly man who had supposedly looked at them wrong. The message was clear: help us find the ghost, or everyone pays the price for harboring a vigilante. Maya watched the news coverage from her apartment, feeling a mixture of rage and guilt. Her actions had inspired fear in the Red Serpents, but they had also brought collective punishment down on innocent people. The community she was trying to protect was suffering because of her campaign against the gang. Some residents began to whisper that maybe the ghosts should reveal themselves, that individual justice wasn't worth communal suffering. This internal conflict pushed Maya to her most dangerous decision yet. She realized that half measures and surgical strikes weren't enough to break the Red Serpent's hold on the neighborhood. The gang's leadership structure needed to be completely shattered, and that meant targeting the person who had ordered the community-wide retaliation, Vincent "Snake" Rodriguez, the Red Serpent's leader and the man ultimately responsible for her father's death. Rodriguez was a different kind of target entirely. He was smart, paranoid, and surrounded by loyal gang members who would die before letting anyone get close to their leader. He lived in a heavily fortified apartment building that served as the Red Serpent's headquarters, complete with armed guards, security cameras, and multiple escape routes. Getting a clear shot at Rodriguez would require Maya to take risks that could easily result in her capture or death. Maya spent a month studying Rodriguez's movements and defenses. She learned that he had one weakness, an ego that occasionally overrode his paranoia. Every few weeks, Rodriguez would make public appearances at nightclubs or restaurants, showing off his power and wealth to impress potential recruits and intimidate rivals. These appearances were heavily guarded, but they also provided opportunities that didn't exist when he was hiding in his fortress. The target Maya selected was the Paradise Club, an upscale nightclub that Rodriguez frequented on Friday nights. The building's architecture provided several potential shooting positions, and the crowd would create confusion that might allow Maya to escape after her attack. Most importantly, striking at Rodriguez in such a public venue would demonstrate that even the Red Serpent's leader wasn't safe from the ghost's reach. Maya's preparation for this attack was more extensive than anything she had attempted before. She constructed multiple explosive bolts, each designed for different scenarios and ranges. She mapped out 3 separate escape routes and established supply caches along each path. She even wrote a letter to her mother, explaining her actions and expressing love and regret for the path she had chosen. Detective Martinez had been working overtime trying to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. Her investigation had identified several potential suspects, including Maya, whose family had been victimized by the Red Serpents. But suspicion wasn't enough for an arrest warrant, and Martinez knew that rushing the investigation could result in the ghost disappearing entirely. She had stationed additional officers around known Red Serpent hangouts, hoping to either prevent the next attack or catch the shooter in action. The night of Maya's assault on Rodriguez arrived with unexpected complications. The Paradise Club was more crowded than usual, packed with civilians who had no connection to gang activity. Maya found herself facing a moral dilemma she hadn't fully considered. Her explosive bolt could potentially injure innocent bystanders if her aim was off by even a few inches. She had positioned herself on the roof of an office building across from the club, the crossbow loaded and ready. Through her scope, she could see Rodriguez holding court at a VIP table, surrounded by his lieutenants and several young women who seemed oblivious to the danger they were in. The shot was difficult but manageable, about 200 yards through a large window with minimal wind interference. Maya steadied her breathing and began her firing sequence, just as she had practiced hundreds of times. But as her finger moved toward the trigger, she noticed something that made her pause. A small child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, had wandered away from their parents' table and was now standing directly behind Rodriguez. The explosive bolt might kill or severely injure the child if it detonated too close to the target. For several long minutes, Maya waited for the child to move, her crossbow trained on Rodriguez while her moral compass warred with her desire for revenge. She had never intended to harm innocent people, especially children, but Rodriguez represented everything she was fighting against. This might be her only chance to strike at the heart of the organization that had destroyed her family. The internal struggle was resolved when Rodriguez himself stood up and moved toward the club's back exit, apparently responding to some urgent message from one of his guards. The child was no longer in danger, but Maya's shot angle had changed dramatically. She would have to relocate quickly to maintain visual contact with her target. Maya abandoned her prepared position and moved to the building's fire escape, carrying the crossbow and trying to stay low to avoid being spotted by club security or police patrols. Rodriguez was moving faster than she had anticipated, already reaching his armored car with his bodyguards forming a protective circle around him. The shot Maya finally took was rushed and desperate. The bolt struck the rear passenger door of Rodriguez's car just as he was climbing inside, and the resulting explosion shattered windows and set fire to the vehicle's interior. But Rodriguez himself was largely protected by the car's armor plating and his bodyguards' quick reactions. He survived with minor burns and cuts, while 2 of his men were seriously injured by flying glass and metal fragments. The attack had failed to achieve its primary objective, but its psychological impact was immense. Rodriguez, the man who had built his reputation on being untouchable and all-powerful, had been targeted in the heart of his territory by someone he couldn't identify or eliminate. The ghost had proven that nowhere was truly safe for Red Serpent leadership, creating a paranoia that would affect every aspect of the gang's operations. The failed assassination attempt on Rodriguez triggered the largest police manhunt in the city's recent history. Mayor's office declared a state of emergency in the affected neighborhoods, bringing in federal agents and additional resources to capture what they now called a domestic terrorist. Detective Martinez found herself leading a task force with unlimited authority and a single mandate: find the ghost before the situation spiraled. Completely out of control, Maya realized her window of anonymity was rapidly closing. The Paradise Club had been equipped with high-definition security cameras that had captured partial images of her retreat from the office building. While the footage wasn't clear enough for immediate identification, forensic experts were enhancing the images and would eventually be able to create a usable description of her appearance. More critically, Maya's mother had begun asking direct questions about her daughter's whereabouts during the recent attacks. The older woman wasn't stupid. She had noticed that Maya's absences coincided perfectly with ghost sightings, and that her daughter had acquired knowledge about weapons and explosives that couldn't be explained by casual internet research. The conversation they needed to have was approaching whether Maya wanted it or not. Rodriguez's survival had also changed the dynamics of Maya's war against the Red Serpents. The gang leader was no longer content to simply defend against the ghost's attacks. He wanted active revenge against whoever had dared to target him personally. Rodriguez put a $50,000 bounty on the ghost's head and enlisted help from allied gangs throughout the region. The hunter was rapidly becoming the hunted. The Red Serpent's response to the Paradise Club incident was swift and brutal. Unable to identify the ghost, they launched a campaign of intimidation against anyone they suspected might have information. Business owners who had shown any sign of relief after ghost attacks were roughed up and threatened. Teenagers were questioned about whether they had seen anyone suspicious carrying weapons or acting strangely. Maya watched the community's suffering with growing desperation. Her campaign against the Red Serpents had achieved its goal of disrupting their operations, but it had also made life worse for the very people she was trying to protect. Some residents openly blamed the ghost for bringing down police attention and gang retaliation on their neighborhood. Others whispered that maybe Rodriguez and his crew deserved to be left alone if it meant peace for everyone else. Detective Martinez was closing in on Maya through old-fashioned police work. The task force had identified the Chen family as potential victims with motive for revenge, and surveillance footage from electronics stores showed Maya purchasing components that could be used to create explosive devices. It was only a matter of time before they gathered enough evidence for an arrest warrant. Maya's next decision would prove to be her most reckless and desperate yet. Unable to complete her mission against Rodriguez and feeling the investigative net tightening around her, she decided to make one final, spectacular statement that would either destroy the Red Serpents entirely or result in her own capture and death. She would target the gang's weekly gathering at their headquarters, where all the senior members met to divide profits and plan operations. This plan required Maya to abandon all the careful tactical principles that had kept her alive and anonymous during previous attacks. The Red Serpent's headquarters was a fortress designed specifically to repel attacks from rival gangs or law enforcement. Getting close enough for an effective crossbow shot would mean exposing herself to multiple armed guards and surveillance systems. It was essentially a suicide mission disguised as an assassination attempt. Maya spent her last free week constructing the most sophisticated explosive bolt she had ever designed. This one contained enough incendiary material to start a significant fire, plus fragmentation components that would maximize damage in the confined space of the headquarters' main meeting room. If she could deliver this payload accurately, it might eliminate most of the Red Serpent's leadership in a single strike. Her mother finally confronted Maya on a Thursday evening, 3 days before the planned attack. The older woman had found Maya's weapons cache hidden in the apartment's basement storage unit, and the sight of military-grade crossbow equipment had shattered any remaining doubt about her daughter's secret life. The conversation that followed was the most painful either of them had experienced since Maya's father's death. Maya's mother begged her to stop, to turn herself in, to consider what her father would have wanted for his daughter's future. She spoke about forgiveness, about healing, about the importance of rebuilding their family rather than destroying it further through violence. But Maya was too far down her chosen path to consider retreat. She had seen what the red serpents were capable of when left unchecked, and she believed her actions were the only thing standing between them and complete control of the neighborhood. The argument ended with Maya's mother threatening to call the police herself if her daughter didn't surrender voluntarily. It was an empty threat. The older woman loved Maya too much to turn her in, but it demonstrated how completely the ghosts' war had divided even their small family. Maya realized that her next attack would likely be her last, regardless of whether it succeeded in eliminating Rodriguez and his lieutenants. Detective Martinez received the breakthrough she had been waiting for when a forensic analyst successfully enhanced the Paradise Club security footage, enough to identify Maya's facial features. The image was grainy and partial, but it was clear enough for pattern recognition software to match against driver's license photos and school records. Maya Chen, 17 years old, daughter of red serpent victims, became the primary suspect in a case that had consumed the police department's resources for months. The arrest warrant was signed on Friday morning, just hours before Maya planned to attack the Red Serpent's headquarters. Martinez assembled her team for what she expected to be a straightforward arrest: surround the Chen apartment, knock on the door, and take Maya into custody before she could harm anyone else or herself. It was supposed to be simple, clean, and final, but Maya had spent months learning to think like someone being hunted. She had noticed the increased police presence in her neighborhood, seen the unmarked cars that had been parked on nearby streets for the past several days. When she left her apartment on Friday evening, crossbow in hand and explosive bolts in her backpack, Maya knew she was walking into what might be the last night of her freedom. The Red Serpent's headquarters loomed before her like a dark castle, its windows glowing with warm light that seemed to mock the cold purpose driving her forward. Maya could see guards positioned at strategic points around the building, their weapons visible and their attention focused on the surrounding streets. Getting inside would require every skill she had developed during her months as the Ghost, plus a significant amount of luck. Maya approached the Red Serpent's headquarters through a maze of alleyways and abandoned buildings that she had scouted weeks earlier. The crossbow felt heavier than usual across her back, weighted down by the knowledge that this would likely be her final mission. She had loaded her most powerful explosive bolt, one that could punch through reinforced glass and create devastating damage in an enclosed space. The building's security was more intensive than she had ever seen before. Rodriguez had clearly taken her previous attack seriously, positioning guards at every possible approach route and installing additional cameras that swept the surrounding area with mechanical precision. Maya counted at least 8 armed men visible from her position, with probably twice that number inside the building itself. Detective Martinez was simultaneously closing in from the opposite direction. Her task force had surrounded Maya's apartment building and discovered it empty, but neighbors reported seeing the girl leaving with a large bag just minutes before the police arrived. Martinez realized with growing dread that Maya was probably attempting one final attack, and that she might already be too late to prevent a massacre. The detective had studied the Ghost's patterns enough to guess at the most likely target. The Red Serpent's headquarters was the obvious choice for someone planning a spectacular final strike. Martinez redirected her team toward the gang's stronghold, knowing that she was racing against time to prevent either Maya's death or the deaths of multiple gang members who deserved arrest and trial, rather than execution by crossbow. Maya had found her way to the roof of an adjacent building, giving her a clear line of sight into the headquarters' main conference room, where Rodriguez and his lieutenants were conducting their weekly business meeting. Through the large windows, she could see 7 men seated around a table covered with money, drugs, and weapons. All of her primary targets were gathered in a single location, presenting an opportunity that might never come again. The shot would be challenging, but not impossible. Maya estimated the range at roughly 150 yards through plate glass, with minimal wind interference but significant elevation difference. Her explosive bolt was designed to detonate on impact with any solid surface, meaning that even a near miss might create enough chaos and destruction to accomplish her goals. Maya set up her crossbow on a makeshift rest constructed from loose bricks and debris, adjusting the weapon's position until Rodriguez's head appeared clearly in her scope's crosshairs. She could see him laughing at something one of his men had said, completely unaware that death was aimed at him from across the street. The irony wasn't lost on Maya. Rodriguez was about to experience the same sudden violence that he had brought to her family. But as Maya prepared to fire, she noticed movement in the building below her position. Police officers were approaching the Red Serpent's headquarters from multiple directions, clearly planning some kind of coordinated assault. Detective Martinez was leading one group, while tactical units moved to surround the building's exits. Maya realized that law enforcement was finally taking serious action against the gang she had been fighting alone. This development created an impossible moral dilemma for Maya. If she fired her explosive bolt now, she might kill or injure police officers who were simply doing their jobs. But if she waited for the police operation to conclude, she would lose her opportunity to eliminate Rodriguez and his leadership team. The man who had destroyed her family might escape justice once again, protected by lawyers and legal technicalities. Maya's internal struggle was interrupted by the sound of her own name being called through a police bullhorn. Detective Martinez had spotted her on the rooftop and was attempting to negotiate her surrender before the situation escalated beyond control. The detective's voice carried clearly through the night air, offering Maya protection and promising that her grievances against the Red Serpents would be addressed through proper legal channels. The negotiation attempt had the unintended consequence of alerting the gang members inside their headquarters to the police presence outside. Rodriguez and his men immediately went into defensive mode, drawing weapons and preparing for what they assumed would be a full-scale assault. The meeting Maya had been planning to disrupt with explosive force was already dissolving into chaos and confusion. Maya found herself caught between two forces that represented different forms of justice. Below her, Detective Martinez offered the promise of legal resolution through courts and proper procedures, the same system that had failed to protect her family when they needed it most. In front of her, Rodriguez prepared to defend himself through violence, the same method Maya had adopted in her war against the Red Serpents. The crossbow remained steady in Maya's hands as she considered her options. She could surrender to the police and trust that the legal system would somehow achieve what months of vigilante action had not. She could fire at Rodriguez despite the risk to law enforcement officers, completing her mission regardless of the consequences. Or she could find some third option that might satisfy both her need for justice and her reluctance to harm innocent people. Maya's decision was ultimately made for her when Rodriguez spotted her, positioned and opened fire with a high-powered rifle. The gang leader had recognized the distinctive silhouette of the crossbow that had terrorized his organization for months, and he wasn't about to let the ghost escape again. Bullets shattered the concrete around Maya's position, forcing her to abandon her careful aim and dive for cover behind an air conditioning unit. The gunfire from the headquarters building triggered an immediate response from the police tactical units. Detective Martinez watched in horror as her carefully planned arrest operation transformed into an active shooter situation with Maya trapped in the crossfire. The building erupted with muzzle flashes as Red Serpent members fired at both the police positions and Maya's rooftop location. Maya realized that her window for a clean shot had closed completely. The conference room was now empty as gang members had taken defensive positions throughout the building, and police officers were advancing under fire toward the main entrance. Her original plan of eliminating the Red Serpent's leadership with a single explosive bolt was no longer possible. But she still had the weapon and the determination to use it. Instead of targeting Rodriguez directly, Maya made a split-second decision that would define the final moments of her war against the Red Serpents. She aimed her crossbow at a large propane tank that she had noticed during her earlier reconnaissance, positioned near the building's main electrical panel. The explosive bolt could rupture the tank and create a fire that would force everyone out of the building, ending the gunfight and giving the police a chance to arrest the gang members without further bloodshed. The shot was fired amid a hail of bullets from both gangs and police weapons. Maya's bolt struck the propane tank with perfect accuracy, and the resulting explosion sent a pillar of flame shooting up the side of the headquarters building. The blast was powerful enough to shatter windows on 3 floors and set fire to the building's aging electrical system, creating exactly the chaos Maya had intended. Rodriguez and his men were forced to evacuate their stronghold as flames spread through the lower floors. They emerged with their hands raised, coughing from smoke inhalation and surrendering to the police officers who had surrounded the building. The man who had ordered Maya's father's beating was finally in custody, along with most of his organization's leadership structure. But Maya's victory came at a terrible personal cost. The recoil from firing her crossbow while under heavy gunfire had thrown off her balance, and a stray bullet from one of the gang members had found its mark. She collapsed behind the air conditioning unit, her crossbow falling from her hands as blood spread across the rooftop's concrete surface. Detective Martinez was the first to reach Maya's position, climbing the fire escape, while tactical officers secured the area below. She found the girl who had terrorized the red serpents for months lying motionless beside her weapon, the explosive bolts scattered around her like deadly confetti. Maya was still alive but badly wounded, her eyes focused on the smoke rising from the building she had just destroyed. The conversation between Maya and Detective Martinez lasted only a few minutes, but it covered months of frustration, justice, and moral complexity. Maya explained her actions not as terrorism but as protection. She had done what the system couldn't or wouldn't do to defend her community from gang violence. Martinez acknowledged the failures that had driven Maya to vigilantism while maintaining that violence could never be the solution to social problems. Maya's final words before losing consciousness were about her mother, asking Martinez to tell the older woman that everything she had done was meant to honor her father's memory and protect the family they had tried so hard to build. The girl who had transformed herself from victim to hunter was finally at peace, knowing that Rodriguez would face justice and that the Red Serpent's reign of terror was effectively over. Maya survived her injuries, but her recovery took place in a hospital room that was also a jail cell. Federal prosecutors had filed multiple charges against her, including domestic terrorism, weapons violations, and assault with deadly force. The same legal system that had failed to protect her family was now working overtime to ensure she faced consequences for taking justice into her own hands. Detective Martinez visited Maya regularly during her recovery, partly from professional obligation but mostly from personal curiosity about the girl who had accomplished what months of police work couldn't achieve. The Red Serpents were effectively finished as an organization. Rodriguez and 6 of his lieutenants were facing life sentences, while lower-level members had either fled the city or been arrested in the chaos following the headquarters fire. The community's reaction to Maya's capture was complex and divided. Some residents viewed her as a hero who had finally stood up to gang intimidation when no one else would. They organized rallies calling for her release and started a legal defense fund that raised thousands of dollars within days. Others worried that celebrating vigilante violence would encourage copycat attacks and undermine respect for law enforcement. Maya's mother struggled with emotions that ranged from pride to horror as she watched her daughter become a symbol of resistance against gang violence. The quiet woman who had once urged forgiveness now found herself thrust into media attention as reporters sought to understand what could drive a teenage girl to wage war against organized crime. She visited Maya every day, bringing home-cooked meals and updates about the neighborhood's slow return to normalcy. The trial became a national sensation, drawing attention from civil rights groups, anti-violence organizations, and commentators on both sides of debates about vigilante justice. Maya's defense attorney argued that she had been defending her community when law enforcement had failed to act, while prosecutors maintained that personal tragedy didn't justify taking the law into her own hands. During her testimony, Maya showed no remorse for her actions against the Red Serpents, but she did express regret for the fear and chaos her campaign had brought to innocent residents. She described her transformation from victim to vigilante as a necessary response to systemic failures, comparing her situation to historical examples of people who had been forced to defend themselves when authorities wouldn't help. The explosive crossbow that had become Maya's signature weapon was displayed as evidence during the trial, along with dozens of bolt heads and explosive devices she had constructed. Expert witnesses testified about the sophistication of her modifications and the precision required for her long-range attacks. The prosecution used this evidence to argue that Maya's actions were premeditated, terrorism rather than emotional responses to trauma. Maya's defense team focused on the Red Serpent's documented history of violence and the police department's acknowledged failure to protect victims of gang intimidation. They presented evidence showing that Maya's family had received no meaningful assistance after the attack on their business, and that dozens of other families had suffered similar neglect. The lawyer argued that Maya had become a defender of last resort, for a community abandoned by its official protectors. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict that reflected the case's moral complexity. Maya was convicted on weapons charges and several counts of assault, but acquitted of terrorism-related charges that could have resulted in life imprisonment. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison with possibility of parole after 5, acknowledging both the seriousness of her crimes and the circumstances that had driven her to commit them. Detective Martinez was promoted to lieutenant, partly based on her successful investigation of the ghost case, but she never felt entirely satisfied with the outcome. The arrest had ended Maya's vigilante campaign and dismantled the Red Serpents, but it had also highlighted systemic problems with how law enforcement responded to gang violence in underserved communities. Martinez made community policing and gang prevention her primary focus for the remainder of her career. Maya's imprisonment became a rallying point for criminal justice reform advocates who argued that her case demonstrated the need for better protection of crime victims and more responsive law enforcement. Her story was featured in documentaries, academic studies, and policy papers that examined the relationship between community safety and vigilante violence. The neighborhood where Maya had grown up gradually returned to normal, but the legacy of the Ghosts' war against the Red Serpents lived on in community memory. Business owners who had once lived in fear of gang extortion now operated freely, children walked to school without worry, and families began to invest in their properties again. The area experienced an economic revival that many residents directly attributed to Maya's actions, even if they couldn't publicly support her methods. Maya spent her prison time earning her high school diploma and studying criminal justice, determined to find legal ways to protect communities from gang violence. When she was eventually released, she corresponded regularly with Detective Martinez, developing an unlikely friendship based on their shared understanding of justice's complexities. Both women had learned that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting consequences that seemed unfair. The crossbow that had terrorized the Red Serpents was eventually destroyed as evidence, but Maya's story continued to inspire debates about vigilante justice, community self-defense, and the responsibilities of law enforcement. Her transformation from victim to hunter had ended with imprisonment, but it had also demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal organizations could be brought down by someone with enough determination and nothing left to lose. Years later, when Maya was finally released on parole, she returned to a neighborhood that remembered her as both a criminal and a hero, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources, even when the price of obtaining it proves higher than anyone should have to pay.